We'd like to get our program started, and this afternoon I'm happy to have Madison is going to be singing the national anthem for us. Madison?
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fights o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Madison. That's a great way for us to start off this afternoon. Let me welcome you all here today to our Veterans Tribute on this, I guess I could say, a crisp fall afternoon. I especially want to thank all the veterans who have joined us today. I want to thank you all for your service to our country. I'm Llewellyn Corkum. I'm president of the Gateway Players Theater, and we have been a part of the Southbridge community for the past 47 years. Besides providing theatrical entertainment, we strive to offer other events in support of our community efforts. So today we are here in support of the Veterans Initiative. Last year, Jean and Mike Dupuy approached us with the idea to support the Southbridge Veterans Initiative, a cause that you'll hear a little bit more about later in the program. They researched the veterans that were buried here in Oakridge Cemetery, focusing on one veteran from each war, beginning with the Revolutionary War. In a few minutes, you will meet each one of these veterans. Following the program, we invite you to walk through the cemetery. We have marked out where these veterans are laying rest now. There is inside of your program a map so that you can follow the map as well. Now, to set the scenes for these veterans, I will read a selection written by Seaver Rice called Mysterious Ghosts of Oakridge Cemetery. And a copy of his book can be borrowed from the Jacob Edwards Library. Many of you probably know Seaver. He was a Southbridge legend. He was a writer, and he wrote for the Southbridge News as well. And many who knew him called him Mr. Southbridge, as he spent more than 60 years living in this town. He was a World War I veteran, and Seaver died in 1988 at the age of 95. The 11 o'clock news was over. I clicked off the TV set and climbed the stairs to bed. I'm usually a good sleeper, but tonight, for some unexplainable reason, I rolled and tossed for an hour or more. Being adverse to taking a sleeping pill, I turned on the light, dressed, went out the back door, and jumped over the low stone wall into the cemetery. A brisk walk around the burial ground would calm the tensions and send me into the land of Nod on my return. The night was warm and dark. It was quiet, too, here in the city of the dead. A whippoorwill sounded off from somewhere in the coal forest, and far off on Lebanon Hill, a dog barked. No human sound interrupted the stillness of the night. My walk took me down the blacktop road toward Coombs Street. A few lights shone from windows. I passed the Legion burial plot and kept walking to the other end of the cemetery. The refreshing sound of water flowing over the rock-strewn bed of Cohasset Brook brought calmness. My jaunt took me past the cemetery flower garden and to a spot near the town firefighters' memorial. I stopped at a bench under an aged oak, a good place to rest and meditate, as I have often done over the years. And now I would like to present to you our veterans.
Good afternoon. Normally I'm Ray Petrelli and this is my fiance Wendy. But today we get to be Caleb and Hannah Amberdown. And I'd like to tell you something about Caleb and Hannah. I was a Revolutionary War soldier. I was born August 1736 in Oxford. But back then, most of the towns around us were all Oxford. Dudley, most of Southbridge, part of Sturbridge, Charlton, Webster, Sutton, Douglas. That's how big Oxford was. So to say I was born in Oxford, I could have been born here or in Charlton. It's still, I'd say, the same thing. And the two of us were blessed with 4 children. They went on to achieve some notoriety in town. Our son Calvin became a Massachusetts state representative in 1821. John spent some time at the Southbridge town assessor, and Luther was a merchant who also held the offices of the town moderator, assessor, and treasurer. At Lexington, when the alarm was sounded in 1755, I was 41 years old. I immediately enlisted as a sergeant under the company commander of Captain Samuel Curtis. The Lexington alarm was the first battle of the Revolutionary War, fought between British troops under General Gage and the American volunteers, as the British retreated down the Lexington-Concord Road after they had stolen American military supplies located in Concord. And then later on, I went on to serve 5 years in various military positions. In 1784, I was a contributor to the founding of the Leicester Academy. And some of the early graduates included Samuel Crafts, who became the governor of Vermont, as well as Thomas Hill, who was a future president of Harvard University. And my personal favorite was a young man who was very bright and an inventor named Eli Whitney. The one-time governor of Massachusetts, Embry Washburn, was a friend of mine, and he once wrote about me and said, "He was a class of men which were once scattered through the country, whose independence of thought and opinion gave character and consistency to public sentiment of the community at large. Though these men had little other training than the development which circumstances produced, the lack of education was more than supplied by the strong common sense which had been disciplined in the school of necessity." Well, Caleb passed away April 13th, 1799, and was buried on top of that hill right over there, right here in Oakridge Cemetery. His family continued to be a driving force in the town. In fact, his son Luther was a force in creating Southbridge from parts of neighboring towns, and his son Calvin supported a large portion of the expense of the erection of the Congregationalist church in town. Calvin deeded 1¼ acres of land to the Congregationalist church, which included the site of the present Congregationalist church on Elm Street, as well as the property across the street where the Catholic Charities now operate. It was built in 1821, and it was the first Congregationalist church in the new town of Southbridge. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sean Moriarty, and I want to tell you a story about Oakridge Cemetery resident Benjamin George Dandridge Sr. Mr. Dandridge served in the American Civil War. A total of 159,165 Massachusetts soldiers and sailors fought in the Civil War. Of those men, 133,002 served in the Union Army, 26,163 served in the Navy. A total of 13,942 of these Massachusetts veterans died in the war. 6,115 were killed in battle. 5,530 died from disease. 1,483 died as prisoners. 257 died in accidents, and 557 died from various other causes. The Massachusetts Army units who fought in the Civil War consisted of 62 regiments of infantry, which were the first through the 62nd Massachusetts Regiments, 6 regiments of cavalry, 4 regiments of heavy artillery, 16 batteries of light artillery, 2 companies of sharpshooters, a handful of unattached battalions, and 26 unattached companies. These regiments included the 1st African American Regiment in the Civil War, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, led by Robert Gould Shaw, as well as the 1st Irish Regiment in the state, the 9th Massachusetts Regiment. Now, about Benjamin Dandridge. He was born an enslaved person in Richmond, Virginia in 1845. On December 31st, 1864, he enlisted in the Civil War as part of the U.S. Colored Troops. By 1870, after the war, he and his wife Lucy and their 9 children, his brothers, and their families were living here in Massachusetts. In 1891, Benjamin, a number of his family members, some of whom had married into a prominent family from Lowell, and other residents of Boston's black community, raised funds for a bust of General Benjamin Franklin Butler to be placed in Lowell's new City Hall and Memorial Hall. At the dedication in 1894, Mr. Dandridge had these remarks. Mr. Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, in September 1891, a number of colored gentlemen of Boston decided to present to the city of Lowell, or some of its public institutions, a bust of General Benjamin Franklin Butler. By such a testimonial, they wished to express their love and admiration for one of the very few men who, in all of the political changes so characteristic of our American life, has ever been loyal and true to their interests. We are not unmindful of the courage it took to denounce, in a convention of slaveholders, of which he was a member, the iniquity of slavery and of the slave trade. By the expedient of a definition, contraband of war, he solved the vexed question of the Negro's right to don the uniform of an American soldier and fight bravely, as he did, for his own freedom and the life of the Union. At New Orleans, he found regiments of colored troop that had been organized by the Confederates to take up arms against the Union. With him, it was fair warfare to turn the enemy's guns against him, and the Corps d'Afrique, initially the Confederate Louisiana Native Guard, was mustered into the Union Army and never disgraced the flag, but fought their former masters on many a blood-stained battlefield and gallantly earned their right to freedom. We fully believe he did not favor us because we were colored, but being so conditioned as to be unable to help ourselves. His mind was strong enough, his heart was large enough to take us in as members of the great human family. Mr. Mayor, the colored citizens of Boston are happy in presenting this bust of General Butler to the city of Lowell, believing there could be no more appropriate place for it than in this hall, dedicated to the memory of those who gave their lives to the Union, that it might be preserved, and all men made free and equal under the law. Benjamin George Dandridge Sr. died in 1919 and is buried here in Oakridge Cemetery. As Seaver Rice wrote in Ghost of Oakridge, over a rocky embankment was the grave of Ben Dandridge, a colored man who fought for the Union in our Civil War. He was segregated even in death. He is buried in the so-called colored section.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Billy Bolster. I'd like to introduce you to Spanish-American War veteran George Henry Sales. He was born in 1876 as the only son of George F. and Mary Jane Sales and the grandson of George and Carolyn Sales. The Spanish-American War of 1898 begins with the Wilson-Gorman Tariff of 1894. The American tariff, which put restrictions on sugar imports to the United States, severely hurt the economy of Cuba, then a Spanish colony. Angry nationalists, known as the insurrectos, began a revolt against the ruling Spanish colonial regime. When Spain sent in General Butcher Weyler to stabilize the situation, he put much of the population in concentration camps. The U.S., which had many businessmen with investment interests in Cuba, became concerned. The American public was stirred into anti-Spain frenzy by publishers like Hearst and Pulitzer. Nonetheless, President Grover Cleveland promised he would not go to war. By the time President McKinley came into office in 1897, the uproar over Cuba was continuing, even though Butcher Weyler was gone. In 1898, the U.S. dispatched the USS Maine on a friendly mission to Cuba. The ship was to wait, ready to rescue U.S. citizens who might be endangered by the conflict. On February 15, 1898, the Maine mysteriously blew up. The U.S. blamed a Spanish mine. McKinley gave the okay for war, and by April, both the U.S. and Spain had declared war. In order to assure the world that it was fighting only for the good of Cuba, the U.S. passed the Teller Amendment, which promised to make Cuba independent after the war was over. Once declared, the U.S. fought the war on a number of fronts, including Cuba itself. Soldiers invaded the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, all Spanish island colonies. While the U.S. ground effort was far from organized, with heroics from the famous Rough Riders and other units, the war was never much in doubt, and the U.S. defeated the Spanish with relatively little difficulty. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the war. The U.S. liberated Cuba and got Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines as colonies for itself. Our Southbridge resident, George H. Sales, was a member of Company K, 6th Massachusetts Infantry, U.S. Volunteers, as is shown on his tombstone here at the cemetery. In the war, the 6th Massachusetts was deployed to Puerto Rico, landed in Guanica, and worked its way east to Ponce and Arizaba. In October 1898, they returned to Massachusetts. Unfortunately, George died later that month at Fort Monroe, Hampton City, Virginia, at just 22 years of age.
Good afternoon. I'm Annette Lisi. Our World War I veteran who resides in Oakridge Cemetery is Earl Joseph Durfee. Mr. Durfee was born in August of 1894. the son of Henry Dexter Durfee and Fanny L. Cutting, a farming family on Eastford Road. As the third child of 4 children, Mr. Durfee had older siblings, Lena and Clarence, and a younger sister, Gertrude. Even though the Great War started in July of 1914, the U.S. did not join until April of 1917. Following 2.5 years of President Woodrow Wilson declaring that the U.S. would be impartial in thought as well as in action, the first American soldiers reached Europe in June of 1917, but only started fully participating in October in Nancy, France. The war ended in November of 1918 with 9 different treaties signed within 4 years, the most famous one being the Treaty of Versailles. Our veteran, Mr. Durfee, enlisted on July 24th, 1917, and he became a member of the American Expeditionary Forces, or AEF, in a machine gun battalion. The troops of the AEF were the first American force sent to another country to fight on their behalf before the United States had officially joined the war. These AEF troops, who fought with France and British in France, became known as the Doughboys. Sadly, Mr. Durfee passed away less than 1 year after enlisting on March 15, 1918, with lobar pneumonia at age 23. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Jean, and I have the honor and privilege to speak to you today about Second Lieutenant Watson Dillber. I have a script here I will read, but there wasn't a lot of information about Watson, so I kind of took the liberty of doing a little extra research to kind of fill in the blanks. I was kind of curious as to why Watson is memorialized here in Southbridge, because I couldn't really find initially any connection or the fact that he ever lived here in town. But I'll fill in some of those blanks as we go along. Now, known as one of the most brutal conflicts in recent history, the Second World War wreaked havoc for 6 years, involving 113 countries from 6 continents. Starting in 1939, the Allied forces, mainly Britain, Russia, and the United States, sought to stop Nazi Germany in its conquest for European domination. By 1945, Western Europe had been rampaged. An entire race of people had come close to eradication, and the dynamic power of the many participating countries was to change forever. Tonight, this afternoon, World War II is represented by Purple Heart recipient 2nd Lieutenant Watson Dillber. He was born July 21st, 1924 in Worcester, Massachusetts, the son of Mr. Alvin and Mrs. Ava Dillber. He was inducted into the Army on May 24th, 1943. Now here's where I'm going to go off script a little bit. I found some information, ancestry research. The 1930 U.S. Census finds the Dillber family living in Thompson, Connecticut. That's Father Alvin, Mother Ava, and his sister Lillian, who was about 4 years older than he was. City directories show that they moved around quite a bit. His father was in the textile industry. He was a weaver and a loom fixer and foreman in those capacities as well. In 1924, they lived in Westerly, Rhode Island. 1930, they were in Lawrence, Massachusetts. In 1937, they lived in Manchester, New Hampshire, and North Adams, Massachusetts. And by the 1940 census, they had settled in Northbridge, Massachusetts. By the 1940 census, Ava was the head of the household, and his father Alvin died in 1941, so I assume he must have been institutionalized or hospitalized by the time the census was taken in 1940. In that census, Watson was 15 years old, with only a few more years to live. His father passed away in 1941. His mother, Ava, passed away on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1975. And his sister, who was a very good student, apparently, was an honor student at North Adams High School and later attended Wheaton College. Watson himself attended Worcester Polytechnic Institute, which explains probably why he was an officer in the Army Air Corps. And the Dillber family, since we have veterans here, they were no strangers to service to our nation. His great-grandfather, Alvin, was born here in Southbridge in 1835, and he was drafted into the Civil War. And his son, Charles, was also born in Southbridge. And his father, Alvin, was a World War I veteran, and he is interred here at Oakridge Cemetery as well. His father was born in Thompson, Connecticut, and Watson was in Worcester. Now, the battles of World War II were fought at sea, in the air, and land as well. You've heard the names: the Battle of Britain, Stalingrad, Alamein, Iwo Jima, the Battle of the Bulge, and so many more. The D-Day landings in 1944 are considered the turning point of the war by many, as it resulted in the liberation of Paris and allowed the Allied forces to close in around Germany. In addition to the landing of the Soviets were moving closer to Eastern Germany, meaning that the final year of the war saw Hitler stop fighting offense and switched to tactics of defense. By August 1945, the Allied forces had achieved victory. Approximately 73 million people are thought to have died during this conflict, and the economic repercussions were felt across the participating countries for decades after peace was declared. Our Mr. Dilber was a member of the 19th Bombardment Group, Very Heavy 93rd Bomber Squadron. They flew an assortment of bombers and eventually focused on the B-29 Superfortress. Between March 1945 and the end of the war, the 19th Bombardier Group flew hundreds of incendiary bombing runs over Japan from Guam and flew tactical missions over Kyushu in support of the invasion of Okinawa, targeting kamikaze airfields and support facilities. Second Lieutenant Dillber was declared missing in the Pacific Theater on May 24th, 1945, coincidentally 2 years to the day of his enlistment. In addition to being memorialized here at Oakridge Cemetery, he is remembered in the Honolulu Memorial at Court 7 of the Courts of the Missing United States Army Air Force, World War II. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Linda Bottiglier, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about a Southbridge couple involved in the Korean War. The Korean War began on June 25th, 1950, when some 75,000 soldiers from North Korea's People's Army poured across the 38th parallel, the boundary between the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea to the north and the pro-Western Republic of Korea to the south. This invasion was the first military action of the Cold War. By July, American troops had entered the war on South Korea's behalf. As far as American officials were concerned, it was a war against the forces of international communism itself. After some back and forth across the 38th parallel, the fighting stalled and casualties mounted with nothing to show for them. Meanwhile, American officials worked anxiously to fashion some sort of armistice with the North Koreans. The alternative, they feared, would be a wider war with Russia and China, or even, as some warned, World War III. Finally, in July of 1953, the Korean War came to an end. In all, some 5 million soldiers and civilians lost their lives in what many in the U.S. refer to as the Forgotten War, for the lack of attention it received compared to more well-known conflicts like World War I and II and the Vietnam War. The Korean Peninsula is still divided today. I'd like to remember Korean War veteran Robert W. Bullard. Mr. Bullard graduated from Charlton High School and the New England Institute of Applied Arts and Sciences. He was a veteran of both the Army and Air Force and eventually owned and operated Bullard's Funeral Home in Southbridge from 1970 to 1993, passing away in October of 2007. Mr. Bullard met his wife during the Korean War. Ruth M. Jenkins Bullard was a registered nurse serving in the Air Force as a first lieutenant flight nurse. Ruth passed away in 2013 and is buried here as well with full military honors. I should also mention that their son-in-law, Frank Leo, also served in the military with the 503rd MP Company stationed in Germany from 1971 to 1973. He then served in the 94th MP Company in Boston in 1986 and the 366th MP Detachment, retiring in 212. Frank passed away in 216.
Good afternoon. My name is Pat Haddock, and it's my honor to memorialize our final veteran from the Vietnam War, veteran James DeColis. The Vietnam War was a long, costly, and diverse conflict that pitted the communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. More than 3 million people were killed in the Vietnam War, including over 58,000 Americans, and more than half the dead were Vietnamese civilians. Opposition to the war in the United States bitterly divided Americans, even after President Nixon ordered the withdrawal of U.S. forces in 1973. Communist forces ended the war by seizing control of South Vietnam in 1975. The country was united as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam the following year. Our veteran James is the son of Nicholas and Tomata Dakalis. He was one of 4 children, with his siblings Aphrodite, Nicholas, and Peter. Mr. DeColis was born in 1940 and served from January 16, 1962 until October 14, 1966 as a staff sergeant. He was a graduate of Worcester State College with a bachelor's and master's degree. He was a teacher and guidance counselor for over 30 years at Marianapolis Prep and the Southbridge Public Schools. Mr. DeColis passed away on August 8, 2009.
I'm going to now ask that Dave Adams comes forward and talk a little bit about the Veterans Initiative. Dave?
I have, we're selling challenge coins, and if you're a veteran, you know what they're all about and how they came about. But one thing we do normally is when we thank people for their time and the fact that they're recognizing us as veterans or our organization, we usually give them a handshake with a coin and say thank you. We really appreciate it. I have one for every single one of you that are over here, and you as well over there. And because of all the time, energy put into today's event, and it's a beautiful crowd today. So thank you. Thank you to the Gateway players. Thank you for everything. Appreciate it. Brings a tear to my eye when we hear about these things because it's amazing. I'm a big history buff, and just listening about Southbridge's history is pretty damn amazing. And to the individuals that are buried here and throughout this great state, it's one of those things that we do our best never to forget. And talking about somebody from the Civil War, Revolutionary War, we hold true to those causes to keep them in our minds and our prayers and where we came from and why we have what we have today. We're still the greatest country in the world. There's no doubt about it. And us veterans and a lot of people that have traveled the world already see that and know that. because we have a lot of things that a lot of other people don't. But let me talk about the Veterans Initiative. First, thank you to the Gateway Players for even putting this on and thinking of us as we did this. This concept started with 8 monuments in town. Former veteran service officer Mike Trumbley and I were talking one day at the community center, and he said, you know, before I go away on this earth, I'd love to see those 8 beautiful monuments that throughout town be brought back to a central location so you could actually see them and recognize them and learn from them, because they're all over the place where obviously their families were at. Those 8 monuments, which we could have the DPW do for no cost, turned into about a $1.5 million project after we started doing some planning. We rebuilt the Veterans Council, and we're thriving to this day, and we're doing a lot of great things for our veterans within the town and actually outside of the town as well. But the thing is, we came up with this initiative, and this initiative was to centralize these veterans monuments that we've forgotten about to this day. Because if I could ask everybody where are those 8 monuments, there'd be a lot of us who would not know where those are at today to this day. We also have monuments that are at the DBW right now. We also have a monument, the hiker monument, that's going to have to be moved because there's a $5 million project happening in 2024 through that whole area. And so we came up with this plan, and we originally wanted to consolidate them in one park. But learning the history of the World War Memorial Park right next to the fire station, we said, first of all, the only way it can be moved is if the town residents and the state actually move it, because it's an actual Veterans Memorial Park. It just can't be moved because we said so. So this came together. We hired a architect who has been brilliant to us and helped us out quite a bit. We've done the engineering, we've done the surveys on both parks, and so it's going to be a dresser and elm. Elm is going to be concentrated on World War I alone, and then dresser will be multiple monuments from Vietnam to the old VFW monuments that we have to brand new one from Iraq and Afghanistan. So it's all, the hiker's going to go over there, the Polish monuments going over there. I mean, it's a lot of work happening, but this initiative we can do, you know, and I appreciate all the veterans who have helped us out. So again, it started with 8 monuments to turn into this huge, huge project, but it's been great. At the end, our goal is to make those individuals that served our country be recognized in one area. And so I thank everybody that came out here today to listen to this. I appreciate my cousins, because Ray over here, you know, he's my wife's cousin, and it's great to see him there. We've talked a lot of things about history in this town, and it's been awesome. But the initiative right now, we have raised for the Elm Street project, the World War Memorial Park. We've raised enough funds, cash on hand, to pay for the entire project, all of it. So thank you. We thank you. When I went to the town council and briefed this, our goal was not to ask for tax money from our local taxes. We wanted to do this. We got state money, which is great, but we also raised quite a bit of money through just plain donations from individuals giving us $20 or $5, all the way to people giving us $20,000 at a time. It's been awesome. Our next goal here, though, is the Dresser Park, which is about $1.25 million in the end, because there's a lot of moving parts. And if you get to see the designs that we have over here, they're conceptual, you'll see it's almost like a parade deck. And we want people of this town to be able to sit down and enjoy themselves and reflect and learn about these individuals, from QR readers to little monuments for saying what these individuals were all about, or what those monuments were about. So we're always asking for donations. We're not really good at this because we've never really done this before, so we're really amateurs doing all this. But the town has overwhelmingly supported us, which we really appreciate all of you for that. I think I've rambled on long enough. I appreciate your time today. Thank you for coming out for Saturday on your own time, doing this for us, and we won't forget that at all. And thank you all for coming out. And I'll be over there along with young Bill Riveniter and Dan, if you have any questions for us. But we want to thank you again. Beautiful day to have it too. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. And again, thank you to all the veterans who have joined us today. We truly thank you for your service. And we as Gateway players, this is a great group of people that I've come to know over the last few years, and I want to thank you guys for stepping up. Thank you. So now the part of our program is up to you. We invite you to have a walk through Oakridge Cemetery. Thanks to Jean and Mike Dupuis over here. They have put up markers. There's ribbons and flags that designate where each one of the veterans that you heard about today have been marked out there, as well as in your program is a guide to show you where each gravestone is located. So please have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you all for coming out. Thank you.